Now I'll turn the floor over to Mrs. Alaa El Cheikh, who will delve into another topic within the field of forensic science. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much,
Hello,
Miss Joanna.
hello everyone. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you so much, Ioana, for presenting me. And it was very an interesting webinar and session that you gave. So I hope you're all doing well. My name is Alaa El Cheikh, and I'm a forensic scientist from Lebanon. Today, we're gonna talk about a very interesting topic, the role of psychological profiling in the forensic anthropology. I will be sharing the slides with you now. Guys, can you see the screen?
Yes, ma'am, the slide is visible.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so you might be wondering, how can the study of the bones and behavior come together to solve crimes? By the end of this session, you will see how both fields play an essential role in order to solve crimes and how they work together to give the law enforcement and investigators a deeper understanding of criminal behavior and the crime scenes. I'm going to start with a case that will help you all to get into the concept. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to ask, or maybe in the chat, or maybe I can answer you at the end of the session. Now, if you imagine that you are in the late 60s as a detective, let's say, and there's a series of brutal murders that happening in California, and the killer is taunting the police. Okay, he is taunting them, he is sending them cryptic letters and puzzles, and he claims that he has killed 37 victims, but only 5 are confirmed murders. Despite all the evidence, the police couldn't identify him, and he became very famous. So, the Zodiac killer victims basically were young couples, and they were targeted in isolated areas. He used a variety of methods, including shooting and stabbing, and his crimes were often brutal and without any clear motive, which is make it difficult for the investigators to form a clear psychological profile. His communication with the media included detailed accounts of the murder and threats in order to kill people, and which actually suggested that he needs this attention and he wants this control. He seemed to enjoy playing mind games with the police and the public, which made him actually very hard to catch him easily. So despite the forensic evidence from the crime scene, like, for example, the bullet casings and the cloth fibers, there were no physical evidence. There were no DNA or fingerprints that can link the killer to the murders. So the psychological profile of the Zodiac killer was based on his letters and behavior, which suggested that he might have been intelligent, methodical, and seeking recognition. Now, what was the role of the forensic anthropology? Forensic experts, like forensic anthropologists, examined victims' remains that were still there. And because there was no physical evidence, as we said, no DNA or fingerprints, so it was very hard for them to link the crime to the killer. They had some challenges. So the investigators had to balance between forensic evidence and the behavioral patterns and psychological profiling in order to try to solve this case. So the challenge was that the forensic evidence here was not there. and the Zodiac killer was very careful with his approach. Therefore, psychological profiling became crucial for developing theories about his identity and prediction of his future actions. So now, I would like to ask you actually a question. How would you go about solving this case? Would you focus on the forensic evidence, the patterns of behavior, or perhaps even the killer's psychological profile? You can use the mic if you want, or by chat. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay, so regarding the Zodiac case, how would you guys solve this case? Would you focus on like forensic evidence given to you like DNA and fingerprints? Would you go and study his behavioral or psychological profiling?
Ma'am, as per my understanding, as you already mentioned, that no physical evidences were found, right? DNA evidences and other evidences were not found. So probably we'll go with the psychological profiling.
Exactly. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So as you said, there was no forensic evidence in this case. There was no DNA, no fingerprint to link the killer to the crime scene. So basically, in any usual case, the forensic evidence is essential in order to detect and to link the suspect or anyone, the killer, to a crime scene, which is not here the case. As for the behavioral pattern, we look actually at the sequence of the killing, the location, the timing, which can help us to identify a pattern in the killer's action. In this case, his behavior was erratic. He was not predictable. We couldn't identify a simple pattern to follow. Like, for example, he didn't use one way to kill. He sometimes stabbed, sometimes he shot, and the victims were not from, like, for example, he didn't target only women in their 20s or blonde women, or he didn't has a type. Usually, behavioral patterns are helpful when there are multiple crimes that seem to be connected. And as for the psychological profiling, it actually helped build a picture of the killer personality, motivation, and possible behaviors. So, and this, of course, include their mental state and possible traumas that he lived. So, psychological profiling is based on like some kind of guesswork, and sometimes, I'm not gonna lie, it can be misinterpreted if the data was limited. Usually, profiling is especially useful when there is a little forensic evidence and when the behavior of the killer doesn't follow a predictable pattern. So, in the Zodiac case, profiling could suggest that the killer had a need for attention, power, and control. Now, combining all these methods, as we said, forensic evidence confirms links, while psychological profiling provides some insights into the killer mind, and behavioral patterns offer clues on motives and actions. So now, this case for me was an example of where both anthropology and psychological profiling come into play. Now let's take a step back and break down what forensic anthropology and psychological profiling are and how they help investigators to solve mysterious cases like the Zodiac killer. I'm going to start with forensic anthropology. What is forensic anthropology? Basically, it's the application of physical anthropology in a legal context. What I mean is that we focus on the identification and the examination of human skeletal remains in order to solve a crime. So what are or who are the forensic anthropologists? They are specialists who work with law enforcement in order to identify human remains. They basically examine bones to provide information about the victim, which could be essential in order to narrow down the suspect or even to identify the victim or the deceased. So we're gonna focus on 4 points here. We're gonna know that the forensic anthropology help us to identify the remains, to estimate the cause of death, to determine the time of death, and to provide evidence in criminal cases. Let's dive into the first one, how it can help us identify remains. Basically, it helps us identify the victim and narrow down potential missing persons. And by that, how can we do that? First, we can determine the age. We can determine the age of a person, or estimate it, if I may say, by analyzing certain features of the skeleton. For example, the teeth, or maybe some part of the bones. Let me just say that the study of anthropology is very huge, but since we are running in time, I provided just a little bit of it so that you can be familiar with it. So for the age, we can use the teeth to help us identify it. Also, we can identify the sex. Basically, the most reliable way to determine biological sex is from the skeletal remains by examining the pelvis. As you can tell in the picture, the pelvis for the female is usually wide, as for the male is narrow. And also from the skull, the male generally have more pronounced brow ridges and more like prominent chin. It also helps us to know the ancestry. It can estimate if this victim is like European, African, Asian. We can know that on studying the skull shape and other, of course, the skeletal feature like the cranial and the facial features and etc. And also we can know the height, the stature. And we can do that actually by measuring long bones like the femur. Okay, so basically anthropologists use some formulas based on these measurements, which allow them to calculate the approximate stature or height. So other than identifying the remains, forensic anthropology help us to estimate the cause of death. Skeletal remains do not always provide us with a direct evidence of how someone died, but it can still estimate the cause of death based on certain bone characteristics. So they analyze the bone traumas. There are so many types of traumas. I'm gonna dive very fast into them. For example, the blunt force trauma. And I'm talking here if we have some kind of signs of a fracture, bone breaks, or contusions. For example, if we have a skull fracture, it might have suggest that blunt force trauma, and we can tell that the weapon is a hammer, or probably that the person fall. We can tell that because of the blunt force trauma, because we have studied the trauma of the bone to know what weapon was used to cause it. We have also the sharp force trauma. For example, the stab wounds, the knives, the sharp wounds coming from knives, and the cut marks on bones. We have also the gunshot wounds. They can recognize the bullet holes in bones. And we can also know if there was some kind of a disease in the bones, some bone infections. Also, cancer can be detected. Bone cancer can create a visible deformities in the affected bones. And also the defensive wounds. So they may find injuries on for example, the hands that suggest that the person tried to defend themselves, like cuts or fracture from blocking an attack. Also, forensic anthropology helps us determine the time of death. We can estimate the post-mortem interval, which is called PMI, or the time of death. So how do they do that? Basically, they study the decomposition. So the way a body decomposes after death, I'm talking, of course, is affected by like environmental factors like temperature and humidity. So anthropologists examine the body and assess how far it is in the decomposition process. Also, forensic entomologists can help us to determine the time of death. They study the insects. They examine the type and the life stage of insects found on the body, which can help us to estimate when the death occurred. Also, they can study the bone change post-mortem, and by that I mean after the death, if they were exposed to sunlight, then rain and wind. This causes cracks and flaking on the surface of the bone. Also, we have the livor mortis or rigor mortis. I have put here some pictures. Livor mortis, we're talking here about the pooling of the blood. As you can see, the person right here, there's a pressure. I'm talking about livor mortis here. And then you can see the real picture, how it is presented. Also, we have the rigor mortis. And here I'm talking about the stiffening of the muscle. Also, it can help us estimate the time of death. And finally, forensic anthropology help us provide evidence in criminal cases. So basically, they play a critical role in criminal investigation. They provide evidence that can be used in court. Okay, so when the investigators find skeletal remains, anthropologists identify the deceased based on their skeletal analysis, as we said, the age, the sex, the ancestry, and the stature. And they can determine if the bones show any sign of like gunshot, wound, or a trauma or anything. So forensic anthropologists can be called to testify in court as expert witnesses to explain the findings from their analysis. So by providing detailed information about the victim's identity and how they died, anthropologists help to build a stronger case for the prosecution or the defense in the criminal court. Now let's talk about psychological profiling. What is psychological profiling? Basically, it involves the analysis of a criminal behavior, personality, and so it a criminal behave in a certain way. You need to understand first that we have two types of profiling. There's something called the criminal profiling and the other behavioral profiling. Criminal profiling, we predict the behavior or the pattern. Behavioral profiling focus on how a person behave in a general way. So we can actually tell that behavioral profiling can be a part at some point of the criminal profiling. So psychological profiling help us to get to know the offender characteristic. We know the gender of the offender, if he's a male or a female. We can know the age, which can give us a clue about his behavior, his energy, everything. And we can also study his background, like his personal history, his childhood experience, his social environment, or past activities, which help build a profile of their personality and behavioral patterns. And also, as one of the offender characteristics, to know the mental state, the mental health, in order to understand how this perpetrator or offender is thinking or feeling. The psychological profiling also help us to do a crime scene analysis by knowing the location. So the profilers examine where the crime took place. A specific location, for example, might suggest the offender familiarity with the area and could indicate a particular type of victim that he targets. Also, we can check the methods, how the crime was committed. Was it planned? Was it spontaneous? It can actually give us some thinking about the offender's personality and his level of planning. And third, psychological profiling helps us to know the motive. You can detect the motive by knowing the psychological reasons. For example, motive refer to why the offender committed the crime. Is it about financial gain? Is it about because he was angry? There is revenge. He's obsessed. He has this desire to have the power and control. We can know that. We can study that based on the psychological profiling, based on the motive. Also, we can know if he has some personal issues, like sometimes offender commit crimes in order to deal with some past traumas or in order to meet some psychological needs. Now we've talked about each one of these two apart. How about when they integrate together? We need to first understand the connection between them. So, as I said, forensic anthropology focuses on the physical aspect of a person. It involves about studying bones to determine details like age, sex, ancestry, and height of a victim. This helps the investigator to understand who the victim was. As for psychological profiling, we focus on the mental and behavioral aspect of the person, which is often the offender. So it involves understanding the psychological traits, behavior pattern, and the motivations behind why a person commit a crime. So when these two are combined, they give a fuller picture of both the victim and the offender. For example, while a forensic anthropology can tell you about the victim's physical characteristic, profiling can help you understand why the offender have targeted this specific person based on the offender's tendencies. As an example also, imagine a forensic anthropologist determined that a victim was a young woman in her 20s. She's of Mediterranean descent, and she has a sign of blunt force trauma. Okay, so this is the forensic anthropologist. The psychological profiling would suggest that the offender could have a violent history and he's targeting women in their 20s. How do we know that? How did we know that? We know that because, first of all, anthropologists, based on the skeletal remains, said that the victim was a young woman in her 20s, okay? And it showed the killing was like signs of blunt force trauma. So because of blunt force trauma, we said he has violent history. And he can be targeting only young women in their 20s. So this can be shown also as a pattern. So the combination of physical detail and behavioral analysis narrowed down both the victim and the perpetrator. Now, how can profiling actually enhance forensic anthropology? When forensic anthropologists identify the physical characteristic of a victim, psychological profiling help now narrow down the victim. Okay? If the forensic anthropologist find out that the victim is a young female, the psychological profiling can suggest that the offender might prefer victims at this age. And she's a female and in her 20s. He always targets these people. So this is psychological profiling. This information will help the police to focus their search on the missing person that matched this profile. Also, how it can enhance forensic anthropology, we can link suspect to crime scenes. So the investigators understand what type of person is likely to commit this particular crime based on the behavior and motivations. Also, it can enhance it by knowing the behavioral patterns, like predicting, for example, future action of the offender and studying. So we study the past behavior and the physical evidence from the crime scene and the victim's characteristics. So the investigators, with all what they have right now, they can create a profile of the offender and think of what he might do next. Now, let's explore two real-life criminal cases. I have actually chose two real-life criminal cases from India, where forensic anthropology and psychological profiling were essential in order to solve the crimes. The first one is the Nitari killings. So, a series of brutal murders took place in a neighborhood in Uttar Pradesh. The victims were primarily children and young women. Many of them were reported missing. So, and after that, the crimes were discovered because of human remains that were found near a house in the Nitari village. The investigation eventually led to Surendra Koli, who is the prime suspect. He actually worked as a servant for the family that owned that house. As for the forensic anthropology, they analyzed the bones and the remains, and they confirmed that there was some kind of dismembered parts, and there was severe trauma and abuse before being killed. And they also had to know the cause of death. The victims has been strangled, and some had been sexually harassed, and some showed some signs of surgical-like dismemberment. I need to add here that they could actually link Koli to the crimes because there were some DNA evidence. Here, the DNA evidence is our forensic evidence that linked Koli to the crimes. As for the psychological profiling, they studied Surendra Koli behavior and his background and his actions, which revealed that he has this sadistic nature. And the way of targeting his victims, like he targeted young women and children, this reflected his deep-rooted anger. Now, if we want to think about the combination of anthropology and psychological profiling, we know that it helped establish Koli's link to murder, and the forensic evidence, the DNA, confirmed the brutality, while profiling characterized or clarified his psychological state and behavioral patterns. Now, we might ask why Surendra Koli committed this crime case. Well, there was a lot to say in this. First of all, the sadistic and violent tendencies. He was driven by this pleasure and satisfaction from inflicting the pain and suffering and control over his victims. His brutality, the brutality of the murders, like the sexual assault, the strangulation, the dismemberment, suggests that Koli was motivated by having this desire of control and to dominate his victims. As for the psychological compulsion, we're talking here about that he was not impulsive. He was methodical and repetitive. His pattern of targeting the vulnerable children and women suggests his deep-rooted anger. And we need to note here that there was no significant evidence that pointed to external or material motivation like financial gain or political reason or coercion or anything. His motive seemed to be coming from an internal and psychological need, possibly related, as we said, to issues related of power, control, and the satisfaction from inflicting harm. And of course, he had the opportunity and the access. He was a servant in the household of the family that owned the house in Nitari. So Koli had an easy access to the victims. Now, when I say cognitive dissonance, I mean by that after all what you have read about the Nitari killings, about Koli, he really seemed to be detached from the moral implication of actions. The killings without remorse without having a fear of being caught suggest a psychological disconnection from the social norms and empathy. And of course, as an outcome to this, he was arrested based on the combination of forensic evidence like DNA found in the crime scene and the psychological profiling that identified him as the perpetrator. He was convicted of multiple murders, rape, and other crimes, and in 2014, he was sentenced to death. The second case that we have is the Arushi Talwar murder case. This case is highly controversial and widely reported due to the nature of the crime, okay? Because let me just say that a 14-year-old girl was found brutally murdered in her home in Noida. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. The nature of the crime was very weird because it somehow showed the involvement of her parents. Also, the servant Hamraj was also found murdered in the same house, and both victims had been killed with multiple stab wounds. So as forensic anthropology, they estimated the cause of death by saying they had been stabbed multiple times, and the nature of the wounds indicated a violent and targeted attack. As for the timeline of events, they pointed that the murder to be happening in the early hour of the morning. As for the psychological profiling, they talked about the family dynamics. So the profiler analyzed that the Talwar family relationship and behavior, and they suggested that the murder could have been driven by a personal conflict, possibly related to some family secret. As for the psychological motive, the nature of the crime indicated a personal angry involvement leading to suspicion about the family role. Now, why the crime occurred? There were so many reasons, actually. As I said, it was a very controversial case. First, the personal conflict within the family. The psychological profiling suggested that the tension between Arushi parents may have been played a role. Also, they talked about the relationship with her father. It was suggested that the relationship between Arushi and her father might have been strained, with some theories hinting to a possible sexual assault by the father and to attempt to cover up for a crime of passion, let's say. Second, we have the psychological motive of the perpetrator. Both victims were a family member, and the crime was particularly brutal, point to a crime of personal anger and rage. They also talked about the calmness during the interviews, like the calm demeanor of the parent during the questioning was had so many question marks, like they were so calm. Also, they talked about possible cover-up. There was some theory that the Talwars may have been involved in a cover-up after the crime was committed. And of course, they noted that there was no external involvement. First of all, they initially thought about the servant, Hamraj, being involved in the murder. But when they found the DNA analysis that was taken from the girl, because there was some semen, he was actually ruled out of being the suspect. Now, what was the outcome and the punishment? Okay, so we have the forensic evidence and investigation. Forensic anthropology, they said the expert confirmed that the violent nature of the crime, so both victims suffered from multiple stab wounds, and the wounds indicated a personal and targeted attack. We have the DNA evidence. The DNA testing, including the presence of semen on Arushi's body, led to initial theories about sexual assault. we have the suspicion of the talwars. They were so suspicious about her father and that he might have sexually harassed her. And then we have the arrest. Both Rajesh and Nupur Talwar, which are the parent of the girl, were arrested in connection with the murder. As the legal outcome, they were convicted, okay, and they went to the prison for years. But after that, in 2017, they were out of the prison because there was no actual evidence to link them truly to the crime scene. So these cases that I have gave illustrate how forensic anthropology and psychological profiling work together. Anthropology played a crucial role and a critical role in analyzing the physical remains to know more about the victims, identifying the trauma, knowing the time of death, and linking the victim to the suspects or the offenders, while psychological profiling helped investigators to understand the behavioral patterns, the motives, and how the criminals think and feel, providing context to the physical evidence. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the practical integration of psychological profiling and forensic anthropology. And that can actually be done based on the collaboration between anthropologists and psychological profilers. The communication and the coordination play an essential role in it. For instance, forensic anthropology can reveal the victim age, sex, and cause of death, which psychological profiling can use to infer possible motive or the personality traits of the killer. Also, we're talking about case collaboration. So profiling informs the investigation. It helps narrow down the search for a suspect by identifying the key traits or behavior of the offender. And also, forensic anthropology provides biological and contextual details. It provides concrete biological data about the victim or suspect, and also by identifying skeletal remains and give context to the crime. Also, we can note that combining the biological fact with the psychological profile allows us to understand who and why the crime happened. And of course, we have some challenges when we need to integrate psychological profiling and forensic anthropology. We have some limitations like subjectivity. This is always relying on the interpretation of behavioral pattern, okay? So it can highly be subjective because profilers create profile based on like previous crimes and patterns. And also profilers may be influenced by cognitive biases like confirmation bias if they tend to focus on only the data that support their initial assumption. And there are some ethical concerns in profiling as well. We're talking here about being biased as well and the overgeneralization. And by that, I mean that profilers may overgeneralize based on a set of characteristics that are not always applicable to all the actual suspect. There is no rules that you should follow in each crime scene because each suspect has his own characteristic and pattern and something that differs him from the other. So we cannot just put some ground rules and say that it's applicable to everyone. And also, we have the privacy concerns because profilers here are digging into the mental health, the relationships of the perpetrator and also of the victim as well. So we have issue with the accuracy of psychological profile. It cannot always be accurate, but let me just say that despite these challenges, when the two disciplines, and I mean here by the psychological profiling and forensic anthropology, when these two work together, they complement each other and they help to solve crime more effectively. If the investigators must know, they must be mindful of the limitation and ensure that profiling is used as one tool among many and not the sole approach. They cannot only use psychological profiling to detect or know the perpetrator. They should use forensic evidence, DNA, fingerprints. They should use any evidence they can have, and they should also not ignore the psychological part. Now, I have put here a small recap for you to check.